The other change that has been happening actually also gradually and then abruptly in countries where we work is population aging. And largely this annual economic report is on aging populations. And I will show a few slides from the report about how we adopt to that. So I think that one thing to emphasize that actually the fact that societies become older and there are more old people and fewer young people, in a way, some people think that it's a problem. It is a problem in a sense that I will get back to, but it's also achievement of modern medicine, achievement of education in some parts, achievement of economic development. The main problem with this is that the economic model that we are accustomed to, and that is largely built in the 20th century, the model of welfare state with reasonable provision of old age pensions, healthcare, education, and so on, is largely predicated on a lot of young people and not so many old people. And when you move to the inverse of it, the numbers kind of stop adding up, and that creates a lot of tensions in the society that then populist politicians can exploit. So the real question is not necessarily, how do we get more young people, but rather how can the society kind of converge to the new reality of economics and build sensible economies for basically older societies. And largely the report is about that. And I think the big difference of our report relative to many other reports that were written by other organizations is that we try to look a little bit more in detail at the political economy of it. What do people think and how can you convince people to change the economic model? And this is the last chapter. Now, I think that people from 1960s were expecting that this kind of aging and will happen with development. I think, part of it is healthcare, part of it is the rise of skill accumulation, education, and the need to learn ever more. And so the kind of classical economic paper about quality versus quantity of children was written in the 1960s with the idea that, as societies develop and become more complex, people invest in quality of children over quantity of children. So what has happened really in thinking since then is pretty much only one thing. I think back in the 1960s, people thought that societies would first develop, become rich, and then the demographic transition will happen as a result of it. What we have seen over the years is these demographic transitions, with some exceptions in sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East, but pretty much everywhere else, demographic transitions, they happen regardless because of advances in healthcare, education, lifestyle, and so on. Economies don't necessarily reach the levels of advanced economies in terms of income, but still the structure of the population changes. Actually, when we looked at among countries where we invest, which is the economy with the oldest average worker, which is the economy with the oldest average person, which is the economy with the oldest average voter. These are all actually three different economies, because in some places people are old but they're not very keen to work. In some places people are old and keen to work but they don't vote as much in older years, or young people vote more. In some places only old people vote. So the three economies actually that tick these boxes are all around here: Greece, Bulgaria, and Croatia. So somehow the Balkans, actually broadly defined, is a place where people age gracefully and fast relative to many other places in the world. Maybe there is something in the environment, maybe in the... It's hard to know. But I actually went to the farmer's market this morning, and it was delightful because I actually saw how kiwis from the orchard look like for the first time in my life. I actually, somehow for decades only saw supermarket kiwis. So you learn. But it's actually wonderful to actually see that there is still simple edible food around here, and maybe that's part of the recipe. One way or the other, it's just to say that in this part of the world, probably aging will happen faster than in many other parts, probably before high levels of income are achieved. And so the task is there to transform the economies. So in terms of the three answers to what can be done, so if you just technically look at what population aging does to economic growth, it's kind of a lot and not much. If you crunch the numbers, it probably will reduce economic growth every year by about 0.4 percentage points. So you go from 3.5% to 3.1. It's not huge. But certainly it becomes very difficult to finance healthcare, and people are older, finance pensions, and even finance education, because if you have fast depopulating villages in rural areas, having school for 5 kids and some quality of teaching is actually very difficult relative to having a school for 50 kids, and so on. So these are actually real issues of not so much growth, but economic management in the society. And there are more or less 3 answers to how one can address the pressures that come from aging. One of them is migration. The other is automation. You try to automate tasks so that you can do jobs with fewer people. And the third one is working more. And in some ways it's just plainly working longer, and in other ways it's more people working, mostly higher labor force participation among women. Different societies adjust in different ways. The one observation about migration is that if you actually assume that people just move, there are still parts of the world that can supply a lot of migrants, say in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Middle East. And one can make a relatively generous assumption that once these people move to places like Germany or Montenegro or Italy, they become like locals in terms of their demographic profile. They age like locals, they have health of the locals, and they have children sort of in the same numbers as locals. So if you make this assumption, you need insane amounts of immigration to offset the impact of aging, because immigrants come and age, basically, as well. And in places like Korea, it would need to be 5% a year inflows. In places like Montenegro, it would need to be 1% a year of population, but it's still way more than on average observed in these economies. Then you can adopt kind of a Gulf model. You can invite people in, and you can tell them that they can come for 2, 4 years, 5 years, and then move back to where they came from, and you import new people. So those people, they don't age, they don't produce kids, etc. There are a couple of problems with it. Firstly, it's difficult to do it for highly skilled people. Even the Gulf doesn't manage. If you need to import professional doctors, etc., they would like to come with their families and stay. But then, for taxi drivers, etc., it works. But even then, you need very large numbers of these people. So the diamond is the current levels of migration. So there are only a couple of economies like Australia and Britain that basically, these numbers are more or less in line with the current levels of migration. And the current levels of migration in those countries are also relatively large. And create all sorts of tensions. So that answer by itself doesn't work very well. Automation can actually alleviate some pressures, but probably not infinitely. So I think that one thing with AI is that it's kind of not very likely to do long-term care and cleaning and construction and a lot of things that actually are still required in aging populations. But it certainly can be very useful in changing the profile of jobs. So I will come back to it if I have time, but one way through which economies actually have been successfully adjusting to demographic pressures is that the jobs have become less physical and more age-friendly. So then older people can stay in working and can be productive for longer. The jobs have become also a little bit more friendly to part-time work, which may be important for women labor force participation. So leveraging technology to continue moving in that direction is important. And certainly as societies age, the kind of average job you have has to change a little bit. The jobs in mining and manufacturing, etc., without much automation will always be young people's jobs. Without a lot of automation, they can be in part older people's jobs. So where actually a lot can be done is through working longer. And there are societies there that have aged a lot, that resolutely don't like immigration. And if you look at what has been happening in Japan and Taiwan and a few other economies, the answer is almost universally that people have been working a lot longer, and the labor force participation between men and women is fairly equal. One can do a little bit of kind of maths behind it and see what will actually be needed. So one element is closing gender gaps, and that can yield a lot in certain economies, and even in economies like Montenegro, it can still be a very important part of adjustment. The big adjustment in general, although to a lesser extent here, would come from older people working more. And actually, you know, what you would probably need in this modeling exercises like that we did is getting to the 75th percentile of the distribution of that ratio in advanced economies, which happens to be Denmark. And in Denmark, about 30% of people aged 60 and above work. They do something, and I think it's kind of full-time equivalent figure. Actually, Montenegro is not far off, and even Serbia, Albania, as I mentioned, Bulgaria is a lot further away, but it's still not trivial to actually convince people to work and to create these opportunities, and also imperative.